Well, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Thanks for attending, which will be the last session of the day here from 4:45 to 5:15. Just a couple of several housekeeping items. Let's go over real quick since we're getting towards the end of the day. At the close of today's session, we'll be giving away door prizes. Catch is you must be present to win. So if you want to stick around, you have a good chance of getting something cool. And then if you want to come back for the special interest groups, it's from 6:30 to 7:30. Those will be women in the GIS, GIS leadership, GIS early career and enterprise and natural resources and environmental. Another thing, be sure to check out the NCAUG merchandise on the conference page. All the proceeds from that go to scholarship funds. Another thing, you've probably heard this before if you've been sitting here today, is all the sessions will be recorded and put up on NCAG's YouTube page after the conference. It takes a little while for them to get loaded, so please be patient. And also for continuing education credits, which I'm sure everybody wants, please make sure your name is correct on your Zoom login to get that. And that will bring us to attending this session. Welcome. We have a really good turnout right now, almost 30 people. That's awesome. You are here for mapping coastal wetlands, a fieldwork design that complements drone lidar data processing. Our speaker today is Dr. Joanne Halls from UNCW. And just a little bit about Joanne. She graduated with her PhD in 1996 from South Carolina. She's been at UNCW since 1999. Her research focuses on developmental and geospatial technology for improving spatial modeling. Her regional area of interest is in coastal zone, where she collaborates with ecologists, marine scientists, and geomorphologists to develop interdisciplinary models of the landscape. With that, I will go ahead and say real quick before I turn it over to Joanne, that you can go ahead and put your questions for her into the chat box. And depending on how they come in and how many we get, we'll either go over them in real time or we'll wait until the end. We'll just see how that goes. So we'll play that at ear. But without further ado, Dr. Joanne Halls, I'll push it over to you and welcome and thank you for presenting.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for joining us for the last session of the day before the fun stuff tonight. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is a piece of a larger project that we have been working on with the North Carolina DOT. So this is such a great opportunity for us to speak with you today because it follows on, if you were in the last presentation that was talking about species modeling with the DOT, I think this presentation sort of is a natural next sort of fit, or it fits well with that concept because both projects are with the DOT. And in this particular project, we are focusing on new approaches to mapping coastal wetlands. In the chat, you'll see I put a link to another paper that we've written that's based on some of this work. If this project kind of interests you, then you can go check out that PDF of that paper. Okay, so to get started, this work is being conducted to use and test drone lidar data to model and map a variety of wetlands in coastal North Carolina. So I'm going to discuss approaches to how we have implemented this collection process, how we do field work to complement, train, and assess a new wetlands classification model. So the first approach, and I'm going to step through the slides showing you this, but the first approach was to identify different ways of sampling in the field. And what we used was the spatially balanced points approach to identify strategic places to go test into the field. And I'll show you some of the results of that. We collected GPS data using 3 RTK methods, and I'll go over those. And what they were used for, how are they being used to train this classification model, and some of the issues that we've learned with Trimble Business Center and other things, to sort of a lesson learned that might help you as you prepare to go collect field work and to perhaps use lidar data. So as we all know, the wetland delineation approach is pretty clear methodology. You know, it's based on the Clear Water Act in Section 404. The Corps of Engineers, this is their mandate to implement that Clean Water Act. And we must provide, obviously, wetland delineations before any land is developed. But there's difficulties to conducting these on the field, in the real world methodologies for mapping wetlands. Usually these are in really densely forested areas. It's muddy, there's standing water, and essentially it's really difficult to access and it's time consuming. So these maps of wetlands that get produced on the ground can be problematic. So then there's the NWI, which is also problematic because, as many people have said, right, it's usually based on outdated imagery, although we're kind of lucky along the coast. But for the most of the state, it's so outdated, and it's not a data set that we really should be relying on anymore. So in North Carolina, these are the dates of the NWI data. And so as you can see in yellow just along the coastal margin, they're actually pretty good data, right? It's at least from 2006 and up until more recent. But for the most of the state, it's really old data. And so that we have to come up with some new ideas. I've put a link, if somebody maybe can put that one in the chat. This is a brand new report that just came out that discusses the problems with NWI. And since it's the only statewide and national data set of wetlands, I think this report, if this interests you, right, is the pros and cons of NWI data. If that interests you in the work that you're doing, I urge you to take a look at that report. It literally just came out and it discusses all the problems with NWI data. So our goal was to work with the DOT to test a variety of field and UAS, right, drone lidar methodologies to derive wetland maps. So some of our questions have been, can we actually use UAS lidar to derive wetland maps? Just using lidar data, no other geospatial data sources, but just lidar derived from drones. Can we actually produce wetland maps from them? Are they any good? Also, the next question is, what sort of field methods are useful for producing these new wetland maps that are based just on lidar data? So exactly what should we be collecting in the field to help produce maps from lidar data? And then sort of what are the lessons learned from these multiple testing sites that we've been to in the North Carolina coastal plain? That's just an example of one of our ground control point targets and some of our students out in the field. So there are a variety of ways of mapping wetlands, from satellite to airborne to UAS. So it's kind of a nice reminder of what these kinds of sensors can produce and what's their level of accuracy, et cetera, and their cost. Clearly, from the satellite perspective, you get a very wide field of view, but the spatial resolution isn't so great, and the temporal resolution isn't usually very good. And it can be costly, or it can be free if you're using like Landsat. And the data source products are usually multispectral. Airborne data is really good. We can talk a lot about the different kinds of airborne data out there, but its repeat coverage is very spotty and doesn't happen very often. But those are really good data sources, right? They're usually at a higher spatial resolution, but they might not have the spectral data that we might need to map wetlands. And then UAS data can cover a variety of field of view from 50 meters to 500 meters. The spatial resolution can be a half a centimeter up to 10 centimeters. And of course, you can fly it on demand if the weather cooperates. And the cost is relatively low. It's the cost of the sensor and the manpower to get out there to collect it. And there are a variety of sensors that you can now put on payload for different kinds of drones. So we're seeing more and more use of UAS, but what can we really do? I mean, we can't fly the entire state in UAS. That would be problematic, not cost effective. But maybe there's a way to integrate these systems to produce new maps that are of higher quality. So some of the data sets that we've been using in combination with testing the UAS data come from a variety of sources. So some of these are listed here. And in particular, we used nape photography and other orthophotography and other imagery available to help improve our wetland classification for on the ground points. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But this is a summary of some of the data that we've used in the project to go along with the UAS LiDAR data, just to make sure that that modeling result is working perfectly. So the workflow for this project is sort of broken down into 3 stages. The preparation stage, we have to select a site. You know, there's any number of sites that you could go and map for wetlands in the coastal plain. And so we go through quite a rigorous sort of check of where are some places that we can go. We look at a lot of different data. We talk with the DOT and we figure out accessibility. You know, we have to get permission from all the landowners, etc. So it's quite a rigorous process to actually find sites to go to. Once we have selected a site, we generate ground control points. The ground control points, through this process, we have learned ground control points should always be directly under the flight path for your drone. And so one of the things we tested was how great are the GCPs, the ground control points, when they're not under the flight path, right? Say just off that flight path versus directly below. And that test did reveal that it is critically important that the GCPs be directly underneath the flight path. The other interesting thing that we learned through this process is because of the turning radius of drones when they're doing their flight path, it's really important to not put GCPs near the ends of those flight paths. So normally you would think ground control points like rectifying imagery, let's spread them out over the space. And actually you want to bring them in from those ends of your flight lines so that they're useful. So then we also generate these habitat points, and the habitat points are generated using a structured, spatially structured approach called spatially balanced points. And what that means is you can input existing data, existing GIS data layers into your study area and weight the importance of locating a random point inside of these various polygons. And you can weight it based on accessibility. So you can look at all the road networks and driveways and things like that, and try to randomly generate field points that will be accessible. And you'll see the results at one of our sites. A lot of them weren't accessible even after that trial. And then of course there's the flight mission planning, which includes everything about flight missions, like the height of the drone and how many trips and how many times you have to change batteries out, etc. So once those things are all set up, you then transfer all this data to the RTKs, to tablets, and to the drone itself. Then we charge the equipment and we go out. In fieldwork day, we set up 2 kinds of, or 3 kinds of really GCP or RTK data collection. The first is called a Trimble static, which sets up a base station. And it literally runs for the entire time that the drone is flying. The second type of RTK data collection is for the ground control points. And those are collected using a high survey grade accuracy of ground control points, because the drone data is so accurate. You need to have ground control points that are as equally accurate. So we use the survey grade level of RTK data collection there. And then for habitat points, which we use to train our wetland classification model, those don't have to be as accurate. You can stand in the middle of an area that happens to be a wetland type, and it doesn't matter if you're off by a meter. So in that case, we can collect topo points. We're still using an RTK, but it's a much faster data collection method. So we assemble and start the lidar instrument on top of the drone, and then we fly it. And while we're flying, we collect, the GCPs are already out, of course, and then we collect our habitat points. When we come back from the field, we download all the data. We run all kinds of methodologies to process the lidar, and we're not going to talk about all the lidar data processing today because we're focusing more on the field work and how these habitat points can be useful. So those habitat points are then processed. We compute a lot of PDOP stats, we charge the equipment, and then we move on to the next sort of modeling stage of the project. So in the coastal plain, these are all the sites we planned on visiting. There's quite a few of them. We've gone to 10, and the project field component is now done. We decided against going to a few of these for a number of reasons, but these are the distribution of sites, and most of them we got to in coastal plain. So hopefully you guys can see that map okay. So a generalized workflow for the lidar methodology, of course, is we get that data, we then correct it, right, and make it into a map, and then we can constrain it to make it even better. We extract just the ground cloud out from the canopy. We can derive surfaces out of those and a variety of other metrics, and then we create this wetland classification model. That's the generalized workflow for the lidar data. So out in the field, those are the GCPs and habitat points again are collected. Here's an example of what a ground control point looks like. We set up the static survey, which is this one RTK unit, Trimble RTK, that just sits there the entire time for the whole day. And then we conduct the drone flight, which is using this kind of drone with the lidar sensor on it. And there's a shot of our awesome students and Dr. Procope, and it's just an awesome time. Obviously, we're doing this during the time of the pandemic. And so at the beginning, fieldwork wasn't easy, but we managed to get through it all. So here's an example output of some of this data point collection in the process. So what you're seeing on this map are collected ground control points are the black X's, and the yellow X's are where we planned on collecting ground control points. So there were some of them we just couldn't get to place those ground control points, but all the other ones where you can see those black X's, we did collect. And for the most part, we put them exactly where we thought we were going to put them, right? They're pretty close. The other data that you're seeing on here are the orange squares are habitat points that we collected in the field, versus the red squares are the spatially balanced, randomly located points that we wanted to collect. Now, clearly, we want to collect a lot of data, and we know we're not going to get all 140 of these points, but the idea is to have this on the go, ready, it's in the unit, and if we can get to these places, this is where we're going to go to get the data. So what you can see are the places that we really did get to versus what we had planned to get to. So how accurate were these data? The ground control points were really accurate. And so if you look at these precisions, right, they're very, very good. In general, with the PDOP values here that you see in these three columns, PDOP averages that are below 2 is what is required to meet the standards for this type of mapping. And so they did a really good job. Those ground control points were really good. And here are some of the sites listed that we have collected and how many ground control points were at each one, etc. So this slide is just to show you that the relative accuracy, right, using this horizontal position, which is always right better than the vertical positioning, is really good. And that the PDOP values are all below 2, which is really good. Well, there's one here that's just over 2. Now the habitat reference points, now remember these were collected with a faster GPS data collection methodology where you don't have to wait for 3 to 5 minutes to collect a point. So with that methodology, you can see how many we got at each of these sites, and the average PDOPs are still really good, right? And the average horizontal position and vertical positioning is really good for a very quick data capture. So the point being, the Trimble units and the RTK receivers are good even when you're collecting in a fast data collection mode. So what do we do with all the other points that we couldn't collect? So we had all these planned habitat points, and then we had the ones that we actually collected in the field. And the idea is we've got to somehow get more training data for our wetland classification model that we're running in a random forest. So the idea, this is a quick overview of the process, is to merge these two together, select all the points that we couldn't collect, add these new fields. So we're not wiping out the NWI codes, but we're adding new classes, and we're putting a confidence ranking on these classes. So how do we update these points and tell the system what type of wetlands they are? Well, we're using 3 main data sources to do that. The new NAPE imagery that's got a near infrared band is awesome. The North Carolina ortho photos are great, and Google Earth is great. And so as we work with each of these points, we can zoom right in. And remember, we've been there, right? It's not like we haven't been there. We don't know. We do know what the field is like. We've taken a lot of pictures. So we can then classify all of these points that we didn't get to put a confidence ranking on those points, check everything, and then produce a final habitat set of data points along with a ranking for each of the sites that we visit. And this is what that result sort of looks like. So here's the same data points that you saw earlier, except these have now all been updated with a new, as of today, what their wetland habitat type is. So it's not the same as the NWI data that might be several years old. These data points are used as training to tell the system, because lidar data was collected on the same day, right? This to tell the system what is this wetland type right currently, as should be seen in the lidar data. And those points have the same attribute values, right? The same type of wetlands as the NWI, but these are the new points with the new attributes. And then their confidence is shown in the size of these graduated circles. And so the more confidence we had in putting that attribute in there, the bigger the circle. So you can see some of these circles, they have an attribute, right? It's a forested wetland, but we're not so confident. And that confidence could be low for a number of reasons. It could be that you couldn't really see what was in the imagery. It could be that these two wetland types are really close to each other. Oh, that's a really good question. So in the chat is, what are these classes? PEM stands for palustrine emergent wetland. And so an emergent wetland is a grass, right? Like a salt marsh. And PFO is palustrine forested wetland. And those codes come from the NWI methodology for classifying wetlands. So forested wetlands are like a bottomland hardwood forest. And the only difference really between the PFO 1/3 and the PFO 3/1 is whether it's dominated by deciduous. So it's a mixed forest with deciduous and evergreen. And the 1/3 is dominated by deciduous with fewer evergreen. And the flip side is one is dominated by evergreen and has some deciduous in it. The two R's are riverine. One is riverine unconsolidated bottom. It's hard to see some of them, but there's like a little, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the little blue here, that's out in the river. And this is more at the mouth of the creek. So those are the two. Riverine. Unconsolidated bottom just means that it's open water. Okay, but those are, and there's lots. So the reason we picked so many sites around the coastal plain is because there's a lot of different wetland types along the coast. And so we wanted to sample lots of different places. So what does the model result look like? So on the left is the actual NWI data showing wetlands for this site. And on the right is what the random forest model has generated for wetlands, just solely on the lidar data. But with that lidar data, you can derive lots of different variables to feed into this model. And I'm going to show you some of those variables in a minute. But this is just one example output of what the lidar wetland classification looks like. Oh, I didn't put all the variables in there. And we have lots of time. Look at that. I got 4 minutes to spare. So some of the things that you can derive out of this is, obviously we have the digital elevation model, but we can do all the curvatures, the slopes, the mean focal, variance around each data point. We had about 45 different metrics that we derived for each grid cell, each pixel, that we then classified to. And then the model, the random forest model, can bin these things and decide which variables are of utmost importance and produce the output like this. So it goes into in R, you run random forest in R, get all the results back, and then you join it back to your data set back in ArcGIS. This is detecting moist soil. So the areas in blue are not necessarily standing water. These can be wet forested, wetlands that are not necessarily inundated with water. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, so what are our lessons learned? So we're doing some lessons learned right now, right? I think it's really important to plan for field work. Field work can be really complicated, and so we've learned that you really have to do a lot of planning ahead of time. Collect as many ground reference points as you possibly can. Look at those metrics and decide if there are some data points you should not use because some of them aren't accurate. And I think this next one applies to everybody that's here today, right? Just because we have a lot of student involvement and you guys have a lot of employees in your organization, or maybe you have interns, there's got to be a lot of training, right? To be consistent. We've been doing this project for a little over a year, and we've had these different groups of students working on it. And so it's been a lot of training to make sure that all of this data is getting collected consistently. And then I can't harp on the data management enough, right? It's when you have X number of sites and lots of different data and lots of different instruments, data management is key. And that's definitely a lesson learned. And that's a little fly through of one of the lidar data sets collected. But we have lots of these, and my colleague, Dr. Prokope, if you are interested in more lidar data collection kinds of work, she's amazing at this and would be happy to work with you guys. So what are some next steps? We're going to use some of this training data to update this random forest model. We're going to run some more systematic tests of the lidar parameters themselves, like different swath widths and different flight altitudes, to see if we get the same results. And we couldn't do any of this work without funding from the DOT. So thank you to Morgan and all the folks at the DOT who we love working with. This is their toy, right? This is their drone with the lidar sensor, and yeah, it's been really fun learning how to use it and how to process the data. And there's my contact info. Oh, I just see it in the chat that NC1 map now has the IR band. I thought we still had to pay for it. So awesome. If it's being delivered, that's fantastic. Thanks, Rick. Are there any questions for me?
Going once. No additional charge.
That's awesome. We've been sort of complaining about that for a long time. I think a lot of people have.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Joanne, that was very informative. Thank you very much for presenting.
You're welcome.
And thanks for the good questions that we got out of the group. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Yeah, if anybody else has any questions, but thank you a lot, and hope to see you after 5:15 for the door prizes. So thanks everybody for showing up. Oh yeah, there's an exit poll too. Those of you who are still here, if you fill up, it only takes a second. It'd be extremely appreciated.
Thank you all so much for attending. And the door prize is in a different room. So we'll close this one up shortly. And thank you all for participating in the exit poll.
There you go. Go, Joanne. Hope you feel better. That was great.
Look at that. I got it definitely. That's probably better than my class this morning.
You got to go Seahawks too.
You guys have a good rest of the conference.
Yeah, appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Okay, bye.